Welcome all. I first met Dr. Meic Pearse during the 2003-2004 academic year when he came to Houghton to deliver a couple of lectures based on his soon-to-be published book titled Why the Rest Hates the West. At that point, he was on the faculty at the London School of Theology, but I remember attending the lectures and also sitting at dinner with Dr. Pearse and others at Cameron and Mindy Earhart's house, wishing that by some miracle we could entice Dr. Pearse to join the faculty at Houghton. It would be perfect. At that point, Dr. Ron Okerson, then dean of the college, was working closely with the faculty to make Houghton's curriculum more global in its scope and reach. And here was a transatlantic scholar with an increasingly global reputation and strong liberal arts credentials. I knew that realistically it was probably too much to ask or expect. Why would he seriously consider, even briefly, a move to Houghton? For one thing, there was the location issue. London, Houghton. Which would you choose? But amazingly, he did decide to come to Houghton and began teaching here in 2004. In many good ways, Houghton has never been the same since. For one thing, he worked with Drs. Peter Meilander and Linda Mills-Woolsey to develop the East Meets West track of the honors program, and for almost 15 years that program has been going strong, introducing cohorts of gifted students to the history, culture, politics, theology, and literature of the Balkans, that beautiful history-saturated region in southeastern Europe, which various empires have treated as a civilizational crossroad and a place to further their own ends. As soon as I started teaching in the East Meets West program, I saw that Dr. Pearse's first lectures at Houghton hadn't merely been dazzling one-offs. He is a master teacher, and semester after semester, some of Houghton's brightest students have benefited from his scholarly expertise in the complex interrelationships between social and cultural change, geography, language, and politics, along with church history and theology. He's brilliant, a tiny bit opinionated, and always ready to provide a thoughtfully argued, incisive, compelling argument for his point of view. If Dr. Pearse is a person of strong opinions, he's also wickedly funny, in a righteous sort of way. As he playfully wrote in an email invitation to this event, for those of you who don't know, I'm being retired on health grounds. They're sick of me. And he's been describing this as his Valedictory lecture, and I quote, stuffed full of gleefully anticipated final imprecations. His snarky sense of humor inspires snark in return, and thus his former student and East Meets West alumna, Jory King, writes, Dr. Pearse has had a profound influence on many students over the years, and we are hopeful for their eventual recovery. He has bullied many students to great successes, and his alumni work in careers and academic institutions all over the globe, as far away as possible. On a personal note, I would add that if you have followed Dr. Pearse through the Balkans, you will know what I mean by Pearse pace. He never slows down, he never tires, and as you follow his lead, you find yourself thinking, this is either going to kill me outright or make me more buff than I've ever been in my life. And I can only hope it's the latter. If you've ever asked him for a paper extension or an excused absence, you've probably experienced the trademark Pearse growl. But like all who know him well, I've learned over the years that Dr. Pearse is one of the kindest, most generous, most thoughtful people I've ever known. Again, I'm not alone in this. Jory King writes, if he sometimes seems like an ogre, he's an ogre who cares deeply about his students. He once took time out of his schedule to help me through a breakdown by giving me even more work to do and meeting me in Java to make sure I did it. I'm probably the only person that would have worked on, but it did work, and I've always been grateful. In his email invitation, Dr. Pearse declares that after this event, quote, I shall sail gently away, still snarkifying, into the sunset. I, for one, hope and believe that this valedictory lecture won't be the last we hear from Dr. Pearse. His departure is a huge loss for Houghton College, and because there's only one of him in the universe, he will be impossible to replace. Still, like many of you gathered here today to honor him, I will forever treasure his friendship and all that I've learned from him. The life of the mind and heart that all of us share in this place is immeasurably richer because he has been in our midst. And for that, I will always be grateful. So please join me in welcoming our friend, teacher, and colleague, Dr. Meic Pearse.
Thank you, Stephen. I don't even recognize that man. It's so nice to see you all. Thank you very much for coming along to endure one more talk by me. Apparently this event has been widely anticipated. In fact, I understand many have been looking forward to my valedictory lecture for years and years, since right after I started here, which was itself several centuries ago, not long after this place was founded by Captain John Smith and Elizabeth Warren. I'm very grateful for this. Stephen and I go back a long way, as he's already indicated. We've spent over a decade of May terms now cowering in the front seats of a bus, trying to stop our ears against the incessant excretions of what my sainted mother used to call verbal diarrhea from the rows below. I've been well brought up. But one event in particular, we get taken photographs of frequently on these trips, and this is only averagely silly. Back in 2015, yes, in Meic in southern Serbia. So someone will call out from below, do this, so we do that. This was actually taken by Muppet, Christina Mulligan, who commented, a saint and a tyrant stand benevolently above their subjects, united in glory. Canonize Stephen. Following which, Hannah Jager, I just want to point out that Dr. Meic Pearse is holding aloft an extinguished lantern, while Dr. Woolsey is holding the sun. Coincidence? I think not. Being less senile then than I am now, I was able to think of a riposte. While we're stuck in Serbia, you may like Stephen A. Kempis better, but you need me more. Machiavelli. But I think the prize has to go to that swine Ted Janney, who graduated from here in 2013 or 2014, not so much magna cum laude as mirabile dictu. Oh no, here, my shoulder angels are precisely these two men. One is always whispering, there's still hope, forgive the world, it will get better. The other simply says, Now, not all of you know this, but fwag is actually a technical term. And that brings us to the matter of today's lecture, an exposition for non-specialists. A recent essay by one of my students about the impact of Enlightenment thought in the 18th century provoked me to the following comment in the margin. None of the excellent books you have cited lends the least support for your repeated statement that Enlightenment ideas were embraced most by industrial workers and peasants. I have no idea what possible sources can have led you to this insistence, except perhaps for the fatuous and all too popular construal of all past regimes as a sort of trick played on the poor who spent countless ages just waiting for George Clooney to turn up and show them how to live. It wasn't a bad paper, relatively speaking, in that it was at least written in coherent sentences and seemed to have consulted proper history books. My little drop of acid was just a variant on a more frequent comment I make on similar first-year papers about either the Renaissance or the Enlightenment, papers which, despite all my warnings, frequently include garbage about the people who were they, starting to think for themselves. In the margin, I tend to put something like, did none of them do this before? Were they all college freshmen? For several centuries now, Westerners have been brought up to think all their ancestors stupid. And no amount of acid poured out by me in a one-semester class can do more than dent that misplaced confidence, born as it is of 18 years of mis-socialisation. Still, I try. Let's take the classic figure of modernist and postmodern contempt, the illiterate medieval peasant. What, I ask my students, was this person able to do? And let's compare those abilities with the achievements of, say, my students. Our benighted ancestor could tell one plant from another, could gain an approximate forecast of the weather by observing changes in natural surroundings, knew how to plough a field, how to plant crops, how to tend and protect them, how to harvest them. Can my students, can I, do any of these things in the interests of feeding themselves? The medieval peasant knew how to catch and kill animals, skin them, prepare meat from them, how to build a house, how to make a roof, how to spin, sew, and make clothes, how to care for and sharpen tools, not generally to make them. That was a specialist occupation. If he or she lived in a linguistically mixed area, as many did, then the peasant certainly spoke fluently a language other than his or her mother tongue. Finally, the illiterate medieval peasant could read religious art better than I can, and I'm a historian. It's not that I'm uninterested. I'm very interested, but I just cannot remember all of the symbols, the significance of colours, the arcane connections between biblical history, lives of the saints, and traditional embellishments, as well as they could. That's quite a skill list. What can my students do to look after themselves? Beyond calling their mothers, I mean. I've no doubt at all that if the medieval peasant were able to give an opinion, he would consider me, as much as my students, to be the ignorant and useless buffoon. So why the insistence upon our ancestors' stupidity? Is this a universal human trait? Did our medieval peasant, for example, think the same about his own forebears? On the contrary. In all traditional societies, ancestors were actually revered, in some, worshipped. Wisdom consisted in following the ways of one's ancestors, and the reason for that was disarmingly simple. If they had not succeeded in staying alive and passing their ways, nowadays we might also say their genes, down to us, we would not be here. Our ancestors constituted success stories by definition. Innovators, and there were such before the modern world, though they were few, had to answer the constant accusation that they were arrogant, that they were vaunting their own judgment above the proven ways of their forefathers. So pre-modern people believed in tradition, the duty of following the ways of their ancestors, and they saw their lives as a link in the chain running from the past to the future. Their duty was to bequeath to their descendants what they'd received from their ancestors. Edmund Burke is a little late, but he's expressing what by his time seemed like a slightly old-fashioned view, at least for people at his level of society. He's attacking the move away from this. With revolutionaries, he was writing against the French Revolution, he said, it's a sufficient motive to destroy an old scheme of things because it's an old one. As to the new, they're in no sort of fear with regard to the duration of a building run up in haste, because duration is no object to those who think little or nothing has been done before their time, and who place all their hopes in discovery. A spirit of innovation is generally, he said, the result of a selfish temper and confined views. How different to the common parts of our own age, right? So, because, of course, the person who was innovating was vaunting their own judgment above that of received wisdom. People will not look forward to posterity who never look backwards to their own ancestors. So according to that traditional view of the world, decay in human affairs was far likelier than progress. Change was not necessarily for the worse, but the presumption was still against it. The Renaissance and Reformation first began a partial break from this view of things, though even they appealed to a more distant and so more authoritative past in the classical and early Christian worlds against the immediate past of the Middle Ages. And then in the 18th century, Enlightenment thinkers declared a belief in progress. Human affairs were getting better and better. The older, the worse. The ancestors were stupid. But what really gave power to this new view of things were the ideologies that the Enlightenment spawned. For the 18th century saw the birth of human rights, of nationalism, of popular sovereignty and ideas of the general will, thanks Rousseau, of theories of capitalism, of the dawn of modern feminism, and the following century would see the beginnings of socialism. All of these are abstract analytical theories about how the world works or ought to work. They are what postmoderns in our own time have called meta-narratives that seek to explain, in Douglas Adams' deathless phrase, life, the universe, and everything. And to explain it according to the insights of some small cluster of axioms. The endlessly complex structures of actually existing human society, which are the products of millennia of compromise between competing interests, of local and particular insights and customs, of developing traditions and geological layers of cultural development. All of these things are held to be explained and usually dismissed in the all-revealing light of the modern ideologues' unassailable axioms. They were so many accumulations of dead wood, of obfuscation, of scarcely concealed exploitation of one category of person by another. As such, they were fit for the burning. As Rousseau put it, in the natural state of things, as hypothesized by Rousseau, man is born free, but in actually inherited social circumstances is everywhere in chains. The conclusion was obvious: the chains must be broken. And who better to do it than the modern ideologue, whose axioms went to the heart of things, saw them for what they really were, saw the old ways for the irrational accumulation of oppressive trash that they were, would shatter the chains and make men truly free. So the modern outlook believes in progress, the world's getting better and better, our ancestors were misguided and unjust, we need to free ourselves from their beliefs and practices. And so modern people's duty was to make a better humanity and a better future, for the sake of which hardships may need to be borne and violence perpetrated in the present. Now this is summed up by Thomas Paine in his book Rights of Man. Every generation is and must be competent to all the purposes which its occasions require. It is the living and not the dead that are to be accommodated. If that seems platitudinous to us, it's because we've been so deeply affected by that at the time he writes it. That is revolutionary. Right? It's extremely controversial. No wonder that my students' essays, like the writings of the 18th and 19th century ideologues, abound with language about people being blind, about them starting to realise, about Enlightenment thinkers helping them to see, etc. The expressions themselves make apparent the supreme confidence of an entire population that only a modern Western view of things counts as rational, as truly seeing. In that view, all else, whatever it is, and who cares what it is anyway, is just so much mumbo-jumbo. In fact, however, my students do not adhere to the modernist belief in progress. That died the death during the 20th century. Modernists had disbelieved in tradition and elevated their ideologies, which they insisted enshrined progress and a perfect future, for the sake of which they were prepared, as events proved, to torch the earth and kill millions. This, to put the matter mildly, did not work out well. Postmodern people, therefore, continue to be scornful of their ancestors and of tradition, but also of the modernist ideologies. Indeed, they fear that their world is coming to an end as a result of ecological catastrophe, which perhaps it is. This is a point to which we shall return at the end. Postmodern people disbelieve in both tradition, unjust, stupid, wrong, and progress, disproved by the catastrophes of the 20th century and looming environmental disaster. Conclusion: live for the present. Single issue politics, hedonism, loss of identity and direction, apathy. So, how did people with different conceptions of the past in the pre-modern world, how did they look at the matter? Well, I'm simplifying greatly here, but that's all we've got time for. Firstly, many people adhered to a cyclical view of the world, particularly in non-Christian societies, most notably in Hinduism. These account for visible change in the world as we see around us, while insisting upon something like stasis in the longer term. Keeps coming back to the same kind of point. There's the Christian and before that Jewish view, which introduced the idea of linear time. History was teleological. Its broad shape was determined by God, moving toward apocalypse and the second coming and the final establishment of the kingdom of God. Even Christian time, however, wasn't at first significantly more structured than other ancient systems. So, for example, they used regnal years to date things rather than the dates we might now, until the early Middle Ages, and indeed far beyond in many cases. There was a tendency to conflate people and events in the past. It's no accident that many ancient chronicles are vague as to time and place. Many of their details, or even the stories themselves, seem incredible to us because what's being related is mythic truth, either loosely connected with actual people and events or not connected at all. The miracles, for example, attributed to many saints' lives in the Middle Ages are close reproductions of biblical, as it happens, usually Old Testament miracles. I remember several years ago when visiting a high school in Croatia with my EMW students and overhearing a conversation about the castle in the town. The castle had been the possession of the Frankopan nobility, a dynasty that had served the Venetians and later the Habsburgs, and was built between the late 12th and mid-14th centuries. But one of the local students began to explain to one of my students, well, he said, in the old days, there was a man called Frankopan. It also tended to focus upon heroes and great men. The focus upon past heroes is fully consonant with dating by regnal years, but the past was primarily a quarry of authoritative precedents, models for emulation, and warnings or models for avoidance. So, let's come to this man, Machiavelli. He says that classical history teaches us the art of politics, and he looks at the examples of the Romans. They foresaw coming troubles in good time and always applied the necessary remedies. Well, clearly not, or the 5th century wouldn't have happened. But anyway, let's just move on down here. So, as to the exercise of the mind, a prince ought to read history. He should consider the actions of great men, see how they conducted themselves in war, examine the reasons for their victories and defeats, so as to be able to avoid the latter and imitate the former. Above all, he should do what other great men in the past have done and take as a model some earlier figure who's earned great praise and glory, keeping his actions and exploits always in mind. As it's said that Alexander the Great imitated Achilles, Julius Caesar imitated Alexander, and Scipio imitated Cyrus. And Machiavelli follows his own advice. This is a wonderful passage, I think. It's been an inspiration to me, just talking about himself. When evening comes, I return home and into my study. On the threshold, I take off my workday clothes, covered with mud and dirt, and put on the garments of court and palace. Fitted out appropriately, I step inside the venerable courts of the ancients, where solicitously received by them, I nourish myself on that food that alone is mine and for which I was born, where I'm unashamed to converse with them and to question them about the motives for their actions, and they, out of their human kindness, answer me. And for 4 hours at a time I feel no boredom, I forget all my troubles, I do not dread poverty, and I'm not terrified by death. I absorb myself into them completely. Brethren and sistren get a library like his and treat it the same way. But in all of these things, the idea of cumulative development over time is generally absent. These conceptions of the past are all very different. In practice, however, they often overlapped in people's lives. They all had one central feature in common. Tradition was a trust, the enormous gift from our ancestors, which it was our life's duty to hand on to our children. Now, as is generally known, it was the Renaissance and then more acutely the Reformation that saw a departure from at least some of these older ways of looking at things. Neither the extent of that departure nor the pace of change should be exaggerated. Whether or not history is cyclical, the popularity of the theory that it is certainly cyclical. Such as, for example, Oswald Spengler's classic work of 1921, written just after the catastrophe of World War I, The Decline of the West, or in the postmodern Macedonian movie Before the Rain. They characterise societies in crisis or decline, and they give a certain consolation about the inevitability of the present disaster and the vague hope that sometime in the distant future the scales will again be reversed. As my little anecdote about the schoolboy in Kirk illustrates, conflation remains a natural instinct in any age of uneducated people everywhere. As C.S. Lewis observed back in 1945, in the minds of such, the past is a comic jungle in which highwaymen, Queen Elizabeth, knights in armour, etc. wander about. Exactly so. And biography of the famous and infamous remains more popular now than ever, even if we no longer agree with Thomas Carlyle's dictum that history is the biography of great men. For it's far more than Carlyle's gender specificity that we would reject. Increasingly, since the 18th century, both scholarly and popular attention has focused upon social, economic and cultural developments as the drivers of historical change, and rightly so. And this brings us back to the Christian linear view of history. As we mostly all realise, the period from the mid-17th century through to the age of Napoleon saw increasing secularisation, not so much of populations in general, as of politicians, legal processes, philosophers, shapers of high culture in particular. We generally refer to the period as the Enlightenment, a usage to which I defer out of sheer sloth, for with advancing senility I have not the energy to contest received opinion on every single point, but with little clue as to why Christians should concur in a value judgment so greatly at variance with the facts and which damns religion as darkness. But be all that as it may, the Christian linear view of history was not among the things abandoned by the Enlightenment. Indeed, it was enhanced, or rather, rerouted. The political scientist John Gray has written extensively on this point. On his reading, Christian teleology remained only with a new secular telos. The kingdom of heaven was replaced by a range of earthly utopias which must thenceforward be pursued with all the energy that godly Christians had once invested in the pursuit of the celestial kingdom. Early 17th century England saw the emergence of a new eschatology, post-millennialism. According to it, Christ returns only after, post, the millennial reign of the saints on earth. This raises the rather obvious question, who or what then brings in the reign of the saints? And the answer is unavoidable. The saints. The 18th century leaders of the Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards and John Wesley, espoused this view. According to them, the world was destined to become more and more Christian until at last the time of the kingdom of heaven upon earth would coincide with a time of the greatest temporal, and in context Edwards clearly meant material prosperity. And this is where John Gray comes in. He argues that the Enlightenment thinkers adopted this direction of thought, secularized it, and developed the progress myth on the basis of it. Human society was inevitably improving, and this was the trajectory of history. The secular utopias postulated by Enlightenment thinkers, and even more importantly, by the political ideologues who applied their ideas to concrete programs, were, Gray argues, religions without being aware of it. The ideologists were sure they knew where history was going. What were or are those utopias? We've already listed some, but because this is a single lecture, I want to draw attention principally to the two that were to become by far the most important: nationalism and socialism. The 18th and 19th centuries witnessed pell-mell modernisation as countries both industrialised and urbanised. Britain led the way in the 18th century and was followed a couple of generations later by most of the rest of the West. In the developing world, the process continues still. As this happened, old forms of identity fell away or became less meaningful. Pre-modern people had seen themselves, in some parts of the world still see themselves, as being who they are in relation to family, immediate location, lord, landlord, or social superior, and religious community. I am the son or daughter of Griffith ap Rodri ap Owain, who is a servant of Lord Rhys of Penmaen Mawr in the parish of Dwy Gyfalchi, etc. So you talk in North Wales as though you're being slowly strangled. It's painful to speak English. But if I'm a spinning machine minder in a vast cotton mill in early 19th century Bolton, a town perhaps far from where I was born, that form of identification no longer has any meaning. The same is true, however, if I'm a relatively well-heeled member of one of the new professions, a journalist, say, born in the foothills of the Alps but living and working in Turin. During this period of rapid population growth, of urbanisation and industrialisation, two forms of identity resonated most strongly with the lived experience of ordinary people in urban areas: nation and class. Now, for those, and I'm not being rude here at all, but for those who have not with any seriousness studied history, it might come as a surprise that these categories are entirely modern, right? If that's you, then for the sake of brevity, please accept my assurances. My students will quickly confirm the point that this is entirely uncontroversial. We'll get to controversial bits at the end. To be sure, the term nation has long been around. It's there in the Bible, for goodness sake. But before modern times, it meant something different, vaguer, and less salient to an individual's sense of identity. Think of the Native American Iroquois nation, Susquehanna nation, etc. And if that doesn't satisfy you, come talk to me after, or read chapter 6 of Why the Rest, or any book on nationalism. Americans also face the additional hurdle of needing to remind themselves every 20 seconds that nation is not a synonym for state or political jurisdiction defined by its government. It's rather a form of consciousness in your head. As these new forms of identity became salient, became how more and more people came to think of who they were and to define their imagined solidarity group, so modern ideologies were increasingly predicated upon them. Nationalism upon nation, socialism upon class. And much of the history of the world in the past 2 centuries could be written in terms of them. Of these two, it was nationalism that was to emerge earlier and faster and prove to have the greater lasting impact. Both, however, were in sharp conflict from an early date with religious institutions and teachings. And this was true even where, as in Catholic Poland or after 1896 with the emergence of Zionism, religion was held to be a crucial element in determining nationhood. Why? Partly this was because the modern ideologies were greatly more egalitarian than traditional society, which they sought to supplant. And most religious institutions were deeply embedded with the mechanisms of the older society. More importantly for our purposes, it was because the modern ideologies were rationalist. Enlightenment spawned constructs built around several axioms, liberty, equality and fraternity, for example. Religions, by contrast, carry the freight of centuries of experience, of doctrinal accretions, and above all, an awareness of the impenetrable complexity of human relations and the human psyche in the actual world. Let's turn now to the principal protagonist of class solidarity and the ideology predicated upon it, socialism. Karl Marx. Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. And just as they seem to be occupied with revolutionising themselves and things, creating something that did not exist before, precisely in such epochs of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service, borrowing from them names, battle slogans and costumes in order to present this new scene in world history in time-honoured disguise and borrowed language. In case you weren't quite following that last bit, he's taking a tilt there at his nationalist rivals. As with so much that Marx wrote, there's the usual mixture here of profound insight and bunkum. Do people make their own history? I'm inclined to think they do. Are they, as Marx avers, nevertheless constrained by the history that's been made before their own lifetimes and of which they themselves are therefore the products? Undoubtedly. As C.S. Lewis says in The Abolition of Man, there is a sense in which all possible future generations are the patients or subjects of a power wielded by those already alive, such that the last men will be of all men most subject to the dead hand of the past and will themselves exercise least power upon the future. But Marx has a troubling problem. As a materialist, he thinks that we are decisively and only the product of material forces, whether past or ongoing. What's called you is, according to him, merely the sum total of all those historical exigencies, including your genetic inheritance and your social conditioning, and in the present, your digestion, state of tiredness, current alignment of hormones, state of anxiety, etc. And that's it. The Christian will say that, even taking account of all those things, there is still a you who can choose X rather than Y, or vice versa, or something else entirely. That's because the Christian believes we are made in the image of God, who did not merely make the material universe and is immanent within it, but is also transcendent, who has one foot, so to speak, outside, and so can act without being acted upon. Admittedly, God has, in the Christian account of the matter, created vulnerabilities within himself to the point of being incarnated as a man. But that, as the kids say, is a whole nother story. Conversely, human beings have nothing like God's degree of freedom. As a mirror image of God's situation, they are within the physical world, but because in creating God's image, they have a foot, or at least a few toes, outside, such that they are real selves who are not merely driven by external forces or body chemistry, but can act in the full meaning of that word. Now, none of this is really open to Marx. As he himself said, man is not an abstract being crouching outside the world. Man is the world of men, the state, society. Matter being all there is, you are locked inside, a social product. End of story. And yet he can't leave it at that, because he wishes to exhort us to rebel, to overthrow all existing order and usher in a socialist paradise. To say that this scheme demands a choosing self, a person who might or might not do these things, would be an understatement. Indeed, from reading Marx, it's impossible not to conclude that he viewed himself at a minimum as precisely that, an abstract being crouching outside the world, seeing it for what it really was, and critiquing it accordingly, to look no further than his dismissal of religion. Its abolition as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand, he said, for their real happiness. Religious believers merely thought they were thinking, when in fact they were caught up by social forces, the ideologisation of capitalism beyond their understanding. That was why they were religious. Indeed, culture, ethics, art, social mores in general are, in his jargon, mere superstructure built on the true foundations of economic relations. Marx, despite his own analysis, necessarily believed himself to stand somehow outside of all this fog, to be able, in fact, to see that reality for what it was. And he urges us to do likewise, as though, on his account of things, we have a choice in the matter. And then we have this. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. Now, by the time that Marx wrote these words, 1852, they had become a platitude of modernist intellectuals of all stripes. Unlike pre-moderns, for whom tradition and the ways of our ancestors were a resource and an authority, for Enlightenment ideologues, and certainly for Marx, the tradition of all dead generations was a millstone, a burden from which we needed to be loosed, a nightmare from which we needed to awake. Or to shift the metaphor a little, we're back with Rousseau and the chains from which he'd insisted we need liberating. None of the modernist ideologues doubted what we need liberating from, the accumulated wisdom of the human past, which required tearing up and destroying. But there was little agreement concerning to what we ought to be liberated. That is, about what might constitute freedom. For nationalists, socialists, neoconservatives, feminists, and a host of others, all are the unwitting slaves of Plato. All labour under the misconception that freedom is a thing when it is not. Or rather it is, it's a word, the noun or form of the adjective free. Hence it applies only to specifics. It cannot, any more than blueness, serve as a general principle, a raise or a telos. I'm sorry if your ideology went up in flames there, but there we are. He'll get over it. Right. Indeed, Westerners and those elsewhere on the planet, foolish enough to take them seriously, would spend the 19th and 20th centuries killing one another by the tens of millions in their attempts to decide what did or did not constitute freedom. But it would all be worth it, they felt, still feel, as long as the right ideology won in the end. Finally, Marx observes, with humour and irony, that nationalist agitators of his own day, anxious to sweep away the old monarchies so that the people could take charge, and to tear down the multi-ethnic states in the cause of fabricating pure new ones, were busily conjuring up the spirits of the past to their service. They were reworking, mythologising, or outright fabricating national pasts that would justify the nation-states they wished to create, in order to present this new scheme in world history in time-honoured disguise and borrowed language. Quite right. Nationalists have continued to play the mendacious game down to the present. To visit Heroes Square in Budapest, for example, with its pantheon of national heroes, dating back to Arpad in 900 AD and King Stephen in 1000 AD, is to contemplate wryly whether any of them, until at best the late 18th century, would have recognised themselves in the role their statuary now requires them to play. Socialists like Marx have generally been more honest than nationalists in being open about their desire to wipe clean the slate of the past and simply to obliterate the tradition of all dead generations that Marx considered such a nightmare. But not always. The first chapter of the Communist Manifesto, that definitive text of the Marx-Engels opus, begins with the famous words, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles," which is as grotesque a misrepresentation of the past as one might hope to find in the most fatuous high school essay. The past, it seems, is a treasure trove in which everybody finds what he wants, co-opts it for his own ends, and distorts the consciousness and intentions of the real inhabitants of that past in a latter-day cause. Try not to laugh. If history's any guide, the same fate awaits us. In that rather different sense, men make their own history and make it just as they darn well please. These two modern identities, nation and class, and the ideologies constructed upon them, reached a decisive victory at the same moment in the aftermath of World War I. The reconfiguration of Europe in the wake of the First World War saw the birth of the first socialist country via the Russian Revolution and the unspeakably bloody civil war that followed it. Meanwhile, the Versailles Peace Conference redrew the map of Europe on the basis of President Woodrow Wilson's national self-determination, the notion that war would be forfended for the future by creating nation-states such that each nation would have its own state and have borders drawn accordingly. Now, it's long been the received view that the resultant settlement was a principal cause of World War II 20 years later. Indeed, jokes were circulating in Paris itself during the conference that the international statesmen were drawing up the basis for a just and lasting war. Another was that the war to end all war was being followed by a peace to end all peace. And so it proved. Now, the Canadian historian Margaret Macmillan, one of the leading authorities, perhaps the leading authority in a crowded field on that period, has challenged this view somewhat in her best-selling and seminal 2001 work, Paris 1919. She argues that the received judgment of the peacemakers has been too harsh, that the treatment of Germany was not excessive and was not the cause of the rise of Hitler, that the leading statesmen made a relatively good job of settling territorial boundaries given the constraints upon them. That this line of argument has the effect of bolstering the reputation of her great-grandfather, David Lloyd George, is no doubt the merest coincidence. Without wading too far into this argument, I'd venture to suggest that she's right, that the political constraints upon the statesmen were indeed severe, the state of their knowledge obscured by countless partisans engaged in special pleading. But that Dominic Leven, in his book The End of Tsarist Russia, is bang on target in pointing out that whatever the immediate circumstances of 1919, ignoring the interests of the country that would naturally dominate Central Europe, i.e. Germany, which had been defeated, and the country that would naturally dominate Eastern Europe, i.e. Russia, which was convulsed in civil war and whose communism represented a threat to everybody else, could not possibly produce an enduring peace. As soon as those two powers had recovered any degree of strength, the peace settlement would be challenged. And when one remembers the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939, that is exactly what happened. The point I'd want to emphasise, however, is rather different. The task that the peacemakers had set themselves was intrinsically impossible, and so could not but fail. There were no state borders that could be drawn, which would not leave large ethnic minorities in a state dominated by others. Further, there were countless millions of people who were of ethnically mixed ancestry, speakers of several languages, who would now be forced to choose one identity over another, or rather, to have the choice made for them. And finally, there were many millions more who still did not think of themselves in national terms at all. Indeed, without in the least dismissing Margaret Macmillan's valuable arguments, I would actually want to ramp up the traditional judgment a bit. In my reading, World War I is the definitive catastrophe of the modern era, from which most other evils, not just World War II, have flowed. In that reading, the destruction of the old multi-ethnic empires created a crisis of legitimacy which the modernist ideologies failed to fill and never could fill. A crisis which has issued in a torrent of blood more or less ever since, and from whose consequences we remain far from free. Every last one of the conflicts of the Middle East, for example, Israel-Palestine not excluded, is a more or less direct consequence of the failure to create states recognised as legitimate by all who live in them, with frontiers recognised as acceptable since the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire. Pressing the same point, it took until the end of the 1990s conflicts in the Balkans to reach stability after the dissolution of the Habsburg Empire. The interwar period saw the drastic radicalisation of both nationalism and socialism. Now we're getting to the bit that's controversial. In both cases, the development was triggered not by political failure, but by political success. And in both cases, the success revealed that the utopias were unrealisable. Nation. To be sure, the previous century had seen the creation of new nation-states, Serbia, Greece, Italy, Germany, Romania, Bulgaria. But in each case, the statehood had been tempered by combination with a monarchy, whose exercise of government was more concerned with securing domestic peace than with expansionist programs abroad, although the fateful exception of Serbia is noteworthy. All monarchs remained rightfully mistrustful of nationalists. But all that changed after 1919. The populist nationalists were given their head. The map of Europe was redrawn, as Mazzini had said, with then wild improbability 67 years earlier, that it must be, supposedly on the basis of national self-determination. The vanquished states lost territory and people. The resentment among Hungarians was particularly bitter. 30% of Magyars now lived outside of the new mini-Hungary. Germans lived in the newly created Poland, and a few even in Belgium. Turkey and Greece resolved their mutual minorities issue only after a savage war from 1919 to 22, following which 1.6 million people were exchanged between the two countries, the poisonous ramifications of which continue to bedevil the present. But that will be a separate lecture. Just take it from me, it is so. 1 in 8 of the population of Bulgaria was still Turkish. Almost a third of the newly recreated state of Poland were not Poles. The creation of Yugoslavia produced a new set of ethnic resentments of almost mind-numbing complexity, as my EMW students can all attest. Romania had extremely large numbers of Hungarians, Germans, Jews, as well as many Bulgarians, Turks, Ruthenes and Serbs. Almost all states in the centre and east of the continent had important populations of Jews and Germans, especially in the towns. Half the continent, it seemed, was claimed, or at least desired, by multiple states, all of whom claimed the same territory as part of their inalienable homeland. The result was severe domestic instability. In all states, internal politics, dominated by ethnic tensions, fused with the economic dislocation caused by the breakup of the old empires to create a perfect storm. And that was before the worldwide depression struck in 1929. Between all states, resentments smouldered for the same reasons. All were fearful of losing what the peace settlement had granted them. Almost all were determined to seize territory they had been denied. In all countries, majority populations looked for scapegoats, finding them almost universally in the Jews and nearly as frequently in other minorities. And this in spite of the fact that many individuals knew themselves to be ethnic mixtures. Class. But nationalism's rival had also been given its head for the first time. Not by the statesmen in Versailles, but by the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the Civil War that followed. In 1922, the Soviet Union was formally inaugurated as the world's first socialist state. But as the next decade was to make painfully apparent, socialism didn't work either. Its shortcomings were so enormous, but also so apparent to any impartial observer, that the Soviet authorities took good care to let no impartial observers in. The collectivization of the farms was merely the most gigantic of the economic failures. It resulted in mass starvation that led to at least 3 million deaths and perhaps as many as 15 million, depending on whom one wishes to believe, for gathering information was made almost impossible. The communist-inclined Malcolm Muggeridge was one of the few trusted foreigners allowed in, but it was enough to deconvert him. The horror of what he witnessed gave him the first push on his path toward Christian faith. My disillusionment with the notion of a predestined progress towards a kingdom of heaven on earth led me inexorably back to the kingdom not of this world proclaimed in the Christian revelation. Political success followed by crippling problems did not make the supporters of nationalism or of socialism more moderate. It did not cause them to tinker with the mechanisms of their ideologies to account a little better for reality. On the contrary, it generated drastic, murderous radicalization. Forests of paper have been consumed in the difficult attempt to define fascism, and I offer no further refinements here. But if the term means anything at all, and I think it does, it certainly means nationalism on steroids. Nationalism turned from 19th century liberalism and parliamentarism to totalitarianism, militarism, and authoritarianism. It represents the anger of disappointed nationalists, certain that enemies and conspirators are to blame for the failure of the dream. For the dream itself and the ideology that fueled it could not be allowed to be delusions. The failure of utopia must be due to Jews and other ethnic minorities, to capitalists and communists. Similarly with socialism, it couldn't be admitted that the ideology didn't conform to reality. The entire emotional, professional and social lives of its protagonists had been invested, often at great personal risk, into realising the socialist project, the telos of history. That it did not work was simply impossible. Much better to insist that it was being frustrated by obstructionist peasants, petty bourgeois elements, foreign spies and domestic saboteurs. This is most clearly seen in the Stalinist purges of the late 1930s, in which engineers and managers were forced to accuse themselves of sabotage or of being secret fascists and then executed, the better to explain the failures in production that socialist planning had made inevitable. This is a general feature of rationalist ideologies born of the Enlightenment. They are irrational. And in espousing them, the ideologues become so too. But this is a reality precisely opposite to their own self-image, such that many ideologues would rather die than confront the reality which their very political success has made apparent. In the 1920s, 30s and 40s, most chose that the human obstacles to their programs should die instead. For ideologies have a strong appeal and a price. The appeal is the sense of intellectual omniscience they give to the person who embraces them, and the sense of superior righteousness. They're on the side of history, after all. The price is permanent unhappiness, not because the world around fails to conform to the ideal posited by the ideology, but because it never can and never will. For the person addicted to the adrenaline of righteous anger thereby produced, the ideology can be a cruel master, but one that's hard to give up. This was the situation in the 1930s and 40s, as it is again, albeit under different circumstances now. The Enlightenment-derived ideologies, each consisting of a small cluster of axioms or of postulates about the world, do not and cannot describe the full complexity even of the human condition, still less of the universe as a whole. That complexity was enshrined in the geological layers of inherited tradition and of the religious wisdom which modernity brushed aside as oppressive and obscurantist clutter. Vaunting themselves as the products of rationalism, the secular religions are more profoundly irrational than the ancient faiths they brushed aside, a point which the atheist John Gray wholeheartedly agrees with. For reason, it should be remembered, is a methodology. It can only ever speak to us of means, not of ends. Knowledge of ends can come to us only from elsewhere, which brings us back to the religion that the Enlightenment-inspired ideologies rejected. That being so, it's hardly surprising that so many different ideologies arose, some favouring unfettered capitalism, others statism, some nationalist or racist, others universalist, some atomising in their individualism, as with John Stuart Mill, others insisting with Rousseau that men must be forced to be free. Differing as they did in their diagnoses, their protagonists became bitterer enemies of one another than any of them had been to the Ancien Régime. And when the last of the old monarchies and multi-ethnic empires had been finally destroyed in 1919, the competing ideologues fell upon one another like ravening wolves. In their eyes, no crime could be greater than to adhere to the wrong ideology. In a world that believed ever less in Christian morality and Christian conceptions of sin, ideological purity moved into the space vacated by virtue, and the wrong politics into that vacated by sin. Sound familiar? And if fascism and communism are now for most purposes dead, virtue signalling and demonisation of people for their politics remain with us in full force. This is what World War II was all about. The heart of the war, the place where the large majority of corpses piled up, was the clash between the most monstrous and grotesque form of the nation ideology, Nazi Germany and its numerous allies, and its exact equivalent in respect of the class ideology, Stalin's Soviet Union. Finally, you'll be grateful to hear. They went on for about another 3 pages. Right. The Enlightenment-derived ideologies are all, finally, atheistic. At first blush, that statement might sound like no more than an exaggerated version of what everybody knows. They're all pretty much secularists, that's hardly in dispute. Many or most arose as ideas specifically directed against churchly powers. Nobody questions that. But my statement must surely be an exaggeration. Protagonists of each, after all, have found ways of reconciling their ideas with some form of religious belief. Christian socialism was very much a thing, as the kids say, during the 19th century. During the fascist period, some movements even utilised religious identity as a weapon to combat communism, of course. But the traction always lay elsewhere, that Christian socialism was never more than a staging post on the way to an aggressively secular form. The rapprochement between some forms of fascism in some countries and their hereditary churches was never more than an arrangement of convenience. The fascist leader was always transparently non-religious, the believers always well aware that they were being used. Let who will draw contemporary parallels. Nationalism and socialism both began with a critique of the alliance between throne and altar, of the use of traditional churches to prop up regimes that the ideologues wished to destroy. Reorganise those churches, it might be inferred, reorient them away from misuse, and nationalists and socialists might, at an individual level, be reconciled to them. But there would always remain a severe tension between the programmes of the ideologues and received understandings of doctrine and of Christian teaching. People committed to modern ideologies, who wished nevertheless to retain their religious attachments, needed then, still need, to change those traditional doctrines, to challenge traditional understandings of Scripture. This is a tricky undertaking, and frequently not finally credible to the tweakers themselves. Political success has done damage to God, analogous to that done to the ideologues' political enemies. The revelation that even given its head, an ideology does not work, does not increase the sum total of human happiness, meets intractable roadblocks at the level of practicality. All of these things tend, over the long haul, to destroy religious faith. For the ideologues' quarrel was finally with reality itself, a reality that paid no heed to their shrieking and their bullying, and, unlike the populace, simply cannot be coerced. And so the creator of reality was manifestly not on their side. Fury directed at oppressive churches and priests, which, as the Church of England shows us every day, can in any case be cowed along with everybody else, is for them beside the point. For the committed ideologue, God is a sort of ultimate cosmic swine. It was perhaps the novelist Thomas Hardy who blazed their trail, abolishing God and then perpetually summoning him back into existence so that he could punch him again. How dare the created cosmos not conform to my petulant dogmas? Ideologies are still very much with us, but the progress myth that gave them their incandescent power is not. We bicker about race and sex, we moan about social inequalities, but the belief that a new world is around the corner, which an all-encompassing ideology can actualise, that's gone. Nobody believes it. Now we accuse each other of fascism, but the jackboots, the uniformed mass militia and the stated intentions to invade our neighbours are missing. Students call themselves socialists, but the idea of seizing the means of production into the ownership of the toiling masses is the very last thing on their minds. Putting up with shoddy, standardised products dictated by a centrally planned economy, plus a 6-month wait before you can update your smartphone, they'll be the very first to complain. The future is dead. It's as dead as the past that modernity killed. Edmund Burke was right. People will not look forward to posterity who never look backward to their ancestors. If our current ideologies have the ring of exasperated whining, it'll be because that's what they are. But what happens to people? What's left once we believe in neither the past nor the future? Sex and shopping. And then we wonder why we're lost souls with no meaning in our lives and no direction, because every possible avenue of meaning we have killed stone dead as either stupid or oppressive and limiting, or both. In severing the root, tradition and the past, we've killed the flower, the future. Christians, there is a gap in the market. Our contemporaries, of course, do not want to listen to us. But that doesn't mean they have an alternative hope, far from it. The churches of the period before 1789 aligned themselves with absolutist monarchies. And when those regimes came under pressure and were discredited, the Christianity was too. In America, in recent generations, churches have aligned themselves with a particular political agenda, and now that it stands discredited and contemptible, they do too. Nothing of any moment is to be gained by prostituting ourselves once more to the newly fashionable ideas in the hope of a fresh lease of life. Instead, we need to do what we should have been doing all along, pointing to a kingdom that's not of this world, even as we are salt and light in the present. For whatever Christianity is, it is not a fig leaf to cover the embarrassment of the kingdoms of this world at their inability to reflect the powers of the age to come. Okay. If you could stand it and would like to email me, I will gladly send you the text and a PowerPoint of that. But don't we have any questions? Nobody's speaking to me. I don't blame you.
Screenshot of that.
How are we doing on? Not as bad as I feared. I could have taken that a bit more slowly. Whew. Do we have any questions?
For those of us not imminently about to trip into the grave, now what?
I'm a historian. I just look at problems, not solutions. No, seriously, I mean, I kind of pointed in the most general terms at the end. It's not that we are not to try and be salt and light in our society. We are. That may even include politics, for goodness sake, but not under any delusions. Right? But simply hitching ourselves to some particular ideology or current political program is simply, it's a mistake, because the secularist ideologies are, I would say, huge mistakes by definition. They do not accord with the actual state of reality. And so we need to sit a lot more loosely, hold a lot more lightly to the ideas of the society in which we happen to find ourselves. I mean, obviously it's easy for me to say this. I speak as a heretical Anabaptist. Anabaptism, for those of you who don't know, is the heresy that the church consists of Christians. That does not mean that we have to then go the whole Menno and we come completely outside of the world. We can engage with it. Otherwise, what the heck are we doing involved in education here, right? But we need to hold that a lot more lightly than our instincts have told us to do.
Or our elders, yes.
And our elders, yes, those as well. I see that hand.
One of the thoughts, probably the only thought that I ever agreed with the former president of Iran, Valedictory, was that he said that the Holocaust was not a Middle East problem, it was a European problem. It should have been resolved within the context of Europe, not the Middle East. There's also a book I found out recently that was written that is entitled Against Our Better Judgment. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are. And that book has to do with the idea that, in a sense, the Jewish problem should have been resolved not in the Middle East, but in Europe. From what you've said, would you agree with that?
I guess it's kind of undeniable, but there isn't the space to talk about it here. It'll be another whole lecture, but we tend to have cartoonish views of practically everything in the past, and certainly including the Holocaust. The older ones amongst you might be reminded, and the younger ones probably never knew, that the Holocaust wasn't even the Holocaust until the 1970s, right? And that rather nasty anti-Semitism outlived World War II in America as well as many countries in Europe, even after World War II. What contributed towards it was a whole host of factors, and it is not really historically fatuous, it's actually dangerous to mentally create this category of pantomime demons called Nazis, or still less of Germans. Germany was about average for anti-Semitism until the Nazis came along, who alone would do this. Right? So, but that's a separate long talk by itself, I think. So shorthand answer, yeah, sure. But that's, I don't think, our central issue. Yeah.
Would you say that some of the social Darwinism of the late 1800s, particularly even practiced in a place like New York City with regard to merchants, as well as I think we have an equivalent now, which is what I would call genetic determinism?
Yes.
You think those come out of the Enlightenment?
Absolutely. Those who endured my course, Religion, Fascism and Communism in 20th Century Europe last semester will already know that every last one? Yeah, I think every last one, unless I'm forgetting something. Pretty much every last one of the building blocks of the Nazi program came out of elements that were general across Western countries, or perhaps in some cases just particular to Germany, but were not the possession of proto-Nazi groups. Loads of them were espoused by respectable middle-class opinion, right? In America and in Europe as a whole. And it's the lethal combination of them, and then particularly the obsession on anti-Semitism that created the catastrophe that then followed. Yes. Sorry, but just to come back, the social Darwinism, yes, that was an important part of that package. Some are already asleep. We should probably stop.
If there aren't more questions, let's thank our speakers.